In 1978, he conducted a survey of the north side of Trinity Bay, identifying the important multi-component site at Stock Cove in the process. Shortly after, he completed an archaeological assessment of the Upper Salmon hydroelectric development on the island's south coast, northwest of Conn River, and in the process became the province's first independent consulting archaeologist. In the early 1980s, he began a long-standing relationship with the Mayapacook First Nation at Conn River. During his work with them, he surveyed the island's south coast, initially focused on identifying Mi'kmaq sites. His excavations at Lance of Flem, in particular, resulted in the identification of the Little Passage complex, the pre-contact ancestors of the Beothuk. The results of this investigation formed the basis of his 1985 MA thesis, The Prehistory of the Southwest Coast of Newfoundland. Gerry had maintained his close relationship with the Mayapacook First Nation ever since, up until his passing. In 1986, he formed Gerald Penney Associates Limited, the first independent archaeological consulting firm in the province. Over the years, he and his firm conducted some of the earliest surveys of the island's interior and conducted archaeological assessments for the growing mineral exploration industry in Labrador. Gerry's occasional work in the city of St. John's throughout the 80s and 90s culminated with GPA's involvement with the Harbour Interceptor Sewer Project in the city's downtown beginning in 2004. I started working with Gerry in 2006, the same year that the project excavation began. In the decade and a half that followed, GPA's extensive historic research and archaeological investigations have shed tremendous light on the city's history. Over the course of nearly 40 years, Gerry investigated nearly every corner of the province, from Cape Spear to Cape Ray, Pinware to Saglec, and everywhere in between. He had a love of Newfoundland and Labrador history, and this exhibited itself in an encyclopedic knowledge of our province's historic cartography and its book history. Gerry's success in consulting archaeology, no easy task in Newfoundland and Labrador, was due to his understanding the balance between the importance of development and the protection of historic resources, and how to keep all sides happy. He was also good at being proactive and not waiting for the phone to ring. He understood archaeology and the business of archaeology. He was a good cook, he was a good man, and he was a great boss, and he'll be greatly missed by all. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice.
Thank you, Blair. That's great to hear a few words from someone who knew Gerry so well. So on to our public talk this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patricia Wells, who is an archaeologist and documentary researcher with the Arctic Institute of North America at University of Calgary. She is current editor of their journal, Arctic. And Dr. Wells is also well known as the director of the Porter Schwab Archaeology Project, an aspect of her research she'll be speaking about tonight in her presentation, Phillip's Garden, A History of Archaeological Investigation and Innovation Over 9 Decades. Take it away, Patty.
Thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me to speak to your AGM this evening. First of all, I know that the thought of me covering so many decades of research in Porter Schwab is enough to make everybody want to run for the hills, but I can assure you that this is a fairly brief talk. And I just want to hit some of the high points and take you through it. And hopefully we'll get a little sense of the importance of these long-term projects in terms of how they provide a history of the archaeological research, the discoveries that are made, but also just the evolving way that we approach research in archaeology and the technology that we use and the theoretical approaches that guide us. So I've conducted about I think around 20 field seasons in the Porter Schwab area, beginning in 1984, when the whole region was, the whole Porter Schwab region, other than the town, of course, became a National Historic Site, a Parks Canada site. My own history with the area is tied to the late Priscilla Renouf's long research initiatives in the region, which included all of the Great Northern Peninsula. I was among a long line of students who did research through the Porter Schwab Archaeology Project. And I went looking for this information, and I may have missed a few of the numbers, but I can confirm for sure that out of this project, it supported the production of 12 honors papers, 21 master's theses, 2 PhD theses, and 2 postdoctoral fellowships. So apart from the research that Priscilla published herself and with people like her collaborators, such as Trevor Bell, and even people who used the material from the Port-au-Choix project for their own projects out of other institutions. That's a pretty long record of research that's gone on here. The history of the archaeology in Port-au-Choix goes back to the early decades of the 20th century. And it involves quite a number of really great archaeologists, some of you will have known. Tonight, I want to touch on the history of the research in the Port-au-Choix area, but then I want to just talk about the Dorset site of Phillip's Garden. Within this context, I'd like you to show the course of the inquiry, the kind of research questions that were pursued and the methods used, and the theoretical perspectives that frame those approaches to work in Phillip's Garden. It's a really unique site for all the research attention it has received, and it demonstrates how much a long-term program can build the understanding of life in a region. But first, I want to situate you. So the map on the right is Newfoundland, and you'll see that the Port-au-Choix National Historic Site is inside the little black box, which is blown up there on the left. And first of all, going back to the map on the right, I want you to just see that the site is quite close to Labrador. That's only a 10-mile opening there in the Strait of Belle Isle. And it's just further down into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Now, looking at the map on your left, first of all, I want to point out Port-au-Choix. This town of Port-au-Choix is at the bottom of Back Arm, right here, across a narrow isthmus from the mainland part of the Great Northern Peninsula. A number of sites are identified here by their Borden numbers, but don't worry, that is not a full list of the sites. I just want to give you a little sense of what the place looks like. The town of Port-au-Choix has one of the most important archaeological sites in North America, I would argue, and that is the Maritime Archaic Burial Ground. Out here on the outer coast, facing the Gulf of St. Lawrence, is the site of Phillip's Garden. And next to it, on either side of it, are two other sites. They are not Dorset, but they are also Arctic sites. Now, one of the things to note about the coastline along the western side of the Great Northern Peninsula is that it's relatively straight, and there are very few protrusions, such as these two peninsulas that have become part of the park. And so that makes this area particularly important in terms of the movement up and down the coast by people who are traveling, particularly by sea. So if you're coming down here by sea, you're getting out of the wind and the weather if you come inside the Back Arm or you stay close to the coast of the two peninsulas. The area is home to a lot of very important species, and that's part of the reason why the history of human occupation in the area has been so lengthy and has included just about everyone who has ever lived in Newfoundland. The underwater topography along the coast of the two peninsulas is sloping relatively steeply. And what that creates is a sort of an upwelling of nutrients that then attract a lot of different animal species. So there are plenty of birds and fish and whales that spend time under the water feeding on the marine resources. It also brings harp seals to the area. And harp seals in prehistory have always been a very important species in this area. Harp seals are not breathing hold seals. They leave the Arctic as the ice begins to form for the winter, and they head south. And some portion of them come through the Strait of Belle Isle toward the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where they breed and molt and give birth. And then they all head back again to spend their summers in the Arctic, again passing along the shores of the Port-au-Choix and Point Rich peninsulas. Their arrival is dramatic and would have been extremely dramatic in the past. They would have been coming down in enormous herds. They would have arrived every year, twice a year, either heading south or north in enormous numbers. But the time that they stayed in the region was relatively brief. More and more now we recognize that caribou is a fixture of this landscape as well. Now that the park has been so well established for a number of decades now, the caribou are using the peninsulas more and more. So the photograph on the right of that beautiful stag and those does, that was taken near the lighthouse at Point Rich. And anybody who visits the Port au Choix area or lives in the Port au Choix area knows all about how frequent the caribou are in the region, and they would have been an extremely important resource for people living here in the past. I just want to talk a little bit about the landscape as well, because the landscape is really varied here. So the large image shows you an ancient limestone seabed. The whole peninsula's areas is made up of these slabs of ancient oceans that have been slowly lifting out of the water. These old stones have fossils in them. They have cracks and seams, so they create rock shelters. There's very little soil on them, and the plants that grow in this area are unusual. They're considered pioneers, and so you initially have a few little plants that will grow on the edges of the stones, and then slowly they'll fill in. The spruce don't grow very high, but there are other areas as well in the landscape. So the image on the left shows you a hillside overlooking Phillip's garden, which is that golden strip that's surrounded by trees off in the distance. To the upper right, you'll see the long range mountains of the Great Northern Peninsula. And what you don't see to the left is Labrador. So you see that there is also some forest in here as well. And that's home mostly to a lot of moose nowadays. So, okay, we're going to go back to the discovery of this area by archaeologists. So in the bottom left, you'll see that's an image of William James Winterberg, and he made a trip up this way in 1929. He visited a lot of the area, but when he was in the Port au Choix area, he stopped in, like all smart archaeologists, and asked local people if they ever saw any stone arrowheads or stone points, and they directed him to Phillip's garden. So he was really the first one to write the discovery of that site since its occupation. I'd like you to notice the Google Earth image as well, and you see the shoreline. So you see it's not a bad place for landing boats on that beach. Now, of course, the site itself is inside the tree line. By the way, can you see my little arrow? Okay, great. So the site is inside the trees here. So it doesn't go beyond back into the trees very much. And one of the things that you'll notice is just how bright green it is. It's quite an emerald. It's surrounded by these low tuckamore trees. And off in the distance is the much more typical bare limestone landscape. What makes this such a beautiful emerald meadow is the fact that it was occupied for upwards to 800 years, where a lot of seals were killed and a lot of people lived and worked and pooped and everything else. And that made this extremely rich soil. The plants that exist in this ecosystem are very unused to rich soils. And so in fact, they have never penetrated the meadow. So there's very little archaeology beyond these trees. And here again, I'm just going to point out the location of that site on the outer coast of the Point Rich Peninsula. So Winterberg met a young scholar who'd just come back from the war. His name was Elmer Harp, and Elmer wanted to do archaeology in the north, and he asked Winterberg where he ought to go. And Winterberg suggested that he visit Port au Choix, which Elmer Harp did in 1949. He visited a lot of the areas and discovered many sites in the Straits of Belle Isle, both sides in Labrador, as well along the west coast of Newfoundland. The image on the left is one of the Kodachrome images that Harp took. He was an excellent photographer. And if you get a chance, you must look for his book of photographs from the years of doing archaeology. They're filled with fantastic images of the people and places around Port-au-Choix. But this is an image on the left, was taken in, I think this is one of the 1949 photographs, but it could be, he revisited the place and did more extensive excavations in the 60s. So perhaps it's more likely to be in the early 60s. But you will see that he excavated a number of large areas. He actually did use a grid system. He used catalog number system that allowed you to actually reconnect the artifact to a 5 foot by 5 foot grid. So it's a ballpark idea about where he found the artifacts. But the great thing is that it's right there in the catalog number, which was a great idea. He did not collect any of the faunal material at the site, and you'll see that he left it in piles, and they're pockmarked across the site right here. They also had a little tent, and he partially or fully excavated 20 dwellings at the site. So he recognized, while he was doing this excavation, he recognized that the material was of Arctic origin. So he knew that, and in effect, of course, now we know that it's mostly Dorset, but also an earlier group of Arctic peoples called Grosswater. So the people were great friends with Harp. He was very popular. So was his wife and his children, and they had, and again, his book on his time in Port-au-Choix tells wonderful stories of the community. But once people from the community brought out some unusual material culture, he knew right away that there was no way it was associated with what he was working on for his in Phillip's garden. In fact, it was maritime archaic material that they were bringing to him. So in 1968, Memorial University was notified by the town of Port-au-Choix that a resident had uncovered human remains while excavating a basement in the town. And Jim Tuck, who was a new faculty member at Memorial University, and there he is looking like the young New England scholar that had arrived in Newfoundland that he was, and he undertook excavations in the area. The burial ground includes the area that you see in the photograph to the left, which presently is marked with a beautiful monument to the maritime archaic people. And visitors are invited to sit in the circular part of it and to just think about and pause at the site and contemplate its significance. And it is of enormous significance. So by the mid-90s, Priscilla Renouf's presence in the region was well established. Don't forget, she arrived in 1984. Oops, sorry how yucky that image is, but don't worry. She'd conducted a systematic survey for the park to identify sites that had not been discovered before, and she started some excavations at Phillip's garden. She'd been particularly interested in finding a maritime archaic settlement associated with burial ground. So no one has gone back to the burial ground to do any excavating since that date. But Priscilla was particularly interested in finding out where were the people. In Twillingate, there is an extensive maritime archaic burial as well. And there are lots of maritime archaic occupation, signs of maritime archaic occupation in the Twillingate area. So this was an unusual site because Priscilla could not, after many attempts and long seasons of survey work, locate the burial, the community associated with this burial ground. So she began to collaborate with the physical geographer Trevor Bell, who's at Memorial University too. And they launched a project to understand what the landscape was like during the maritime archaic presence in the area. Now, the maritime archaic dates begin around 6,000 years ago. Now, probably the dates are closer to 5,400, but if you kind of give or take the possible range, it could go back about as long as 6,000 years ago. And at that time, the land was still rebounding from the weight of the glaciers. And so much of this area was actually underwater when the Maritime Archaic were living here. So for instance, this isthmus, which is here on the little map, oh no, that's that on this little map right here. This is Back Arm. This is looking into Back Arm. The town of Port au Choix is around here, and the Maritime Archaic burial ground is right there. So all this area right here was underwater. So that certainly saved Priscilla a lot of survey time. She didn't bother to go to those areas. Trevor directed her to higher areas. So where you see this faded red line, that would have been the old shoreline at that point. And she then surveyed more carefully with a greater idea about where to look. And she eventually found the Gould site, which is a scatter of Maritime Archaic material identified on the mainland side of the isthmus. So over in this area. The campsite would have looked across this channel of water to the burial site, and may have functioned as a kind of a short-term habitation for people who came to bury their loved ones or to visit the area. Understanding the significance of this whole area was part of Dominique Lacroix's 2015 PhD on the Maritime Archaic. He looked at the aspects of the landscape at the time, and he compared the material culture as well to what he found from other Maritime Archaic sites. And he suggested that this area was a gathering place for multiple ethnically distinct groups of Maritime Archaic. So he demonstrated these ethnic groups, and he believes that quite a few of them would have, and I mean ethnic groups within the province of Newfoundland, or I should say the island of Newfoundland. And he said that many of them would have visited this particular site. Okay, so I'd like to shift back a little bit now and talk about the Arctic people who occupied the area after it was abandoned by the Maritime Archaic people. So about 2,800 years ago, a group of people moved on to the island of Newfoundland. They were related to the first Arctic people. And this, once they reached this area, once they reached southern Labrador, they were referred to generally as the Grosswater people. Oops, I'm sorry. Of course, something is happening with my phone. All right. They occupied a number of sites in the Port au Choix region, and the sites usually comprised of one or two lightly constructed dwellings. The dwellings would have had slight depressions, or they would have been on the surface. So they really showed that they were lightly constructed. They hunted harp seals that passed by the area during their migrations, and their stone tool remains reflect a kind of a variety of activities, so hunting, butchering, and hide working. So basically what you had was a small little family groups coming on. On this coast, they occupied the western part of Phillip's Garden, so just over here, and over here on the eastern side of Phillip's Garden. So they also would have inhabited just mostly, their scattering of their material, of the Grosswater material in Phillip's Garden, but a lot of it is concentrated around the western side. And Dominique Lavers did her honors paper where she looked at the extent of Grosswater occupation of the site of Phillip's Garden. So while the Grosswater led a mobile, small group pattern of settlement that's typical of northern hunting, gathering, and fishing peoples, the Dorset chose to create a much more permanent community, like their earlier cousins, because the Dorset are ancestrally related to the Grosswater. The Dorset focused their economy also on hunting the harp seals. You know, I was interested when I was an undergraduate in how you had two groups with a shared ancestry with similar technology who are occupying the same place essentially, and they hunted the same animals, and yet they lived really differently from each other. When I was an undergraduate, I was really, and that was a long time ago, it was in the 80s. And so I was, one of the, inspired by the works of Louis Binford, which some of you may recognize as an ancient ideologue. But he wrote a book called Nunavut Ethno-Archaeology. And he talked a lot in a lot of detail describing butchering practices amongst the Nunavut. And I was wondering if I compared how the Grosswater and the Dorset butchered their seals, is that also something that they share, or were their practices different? And in fact, I found out that the Grosswater butchered the whole carcass. There were cut marks on almost every single bone of the seal, whereas the Dorset sometimes didn't seem to dismember the seals completely. So in other words, I didn't find very many cut marks on the Dorset appendages compared to the Grosswater ones. It's like the Grosswater were maximizing the recovery of the skin and the meat from the seals, whereas the Dorset were like, a little bit more wasteful. And more recently, I've looked at their bone, antler, and ivory tool assemblages, and it seems that the Grosswater arrived with all their tools pretty much made. I don't find much osseous tool making going on at the site. It seemed that they came already equipped. Whereas the Dorset site, we have lots and lots of bone cores, blanks, preforms, and tools that once were one thing and had been transformed into something else. So there's much more osseous tool working going on there. But really the greatest difference between them was the way that they settled, just that the Grosswater adhered to their much more traditional way of occupying space, in that they were small groups, highly mobile, creating small sites with very few houses, whereas the Grosswater, or the Dorset, created this massive kind of village. And when the sun is low in the morning or the evening, especially early in the summer, and you're looking across Phillip's garden, you can sometimes see these large depressions in the ground where the Dorset had built these deep semi-subterranean houses. Now, I couldn't find a great picture, unfortunately, but if you look at me and Dominique, and this is Mark's story, walking across Phillip's garden. Dominique is just coming out of a little depression. I'm on the edge of it. It's sort of around here. You can see another one over here. One of the things that stands out is because these depressions tend to get a little wetter than the surrounding areas. So they're quite easy to see. And in fact, in the early days, Priscilla went out and she and Lisa Hodgetts, who was a student at the time, they walked over the whole site and they flagged every one of the houses that they could discern from the surface, and they came up with 68 house depressions on the site, which is really quite something. And of course, we know that Harp had excavated 20 of those, and he excavated some big ones. Everyone has been drawn to these big depressions, knowing full well that they're houses. In fact, I've gotten so good at it now, I can tell you where some of the features are just by stamping around on the ground. The image on the left shows you one of the excavated houses, and the green line that I have surrounding it is kind of the interior of the house. So they had a rare kind of flat stone-lined sleeping platform, and down through the middle, there was a depression, the central depression. Now you'll see an empty space of a lack of stones. I'm pretty sure that those stones were moved by Harp, because he did some of the interior excavation here, but he only ever did the interior. And Priscilla discovered once she was digging outside that she could locate some of the places where where whalebone would have been used to create the roof. Likewise, while Harp recognized these little central depressions, which he thought may have functioned as fireplaces, when we excavated them, we realized that they in fact were post holes, and that there was sort of a bit of a gable construction to the front of the house. The houses were reoccupied over and over. You see stones that had a lamp sitting on them, thrown to the side, to the outside of the walls, or incorporated into the sleeping platforms. There's little middens, and some of these discrete middens date to different periods. So we know that some of these big houses were reoccupied over and over again. So I'm happy to show this picture now. So the houses remained the focus of the research. And in order to understand how many houses there were on the site, and if we were only focusing on the large ones because they were the only ones we could see, we wanted to figure out other ways of locating houses that could be buried. So Ed Eastaugh used magnetometry to see if there were any buried houses and magnetometry is looking for changes in magnetism under the surface of the ground. And the results were mixed, unfortunately, because while the limestone in the area is so magnetically quiet, we expected to see anything jump out. We were sometimes picking up iron-rich erratics that had been carried down by the glaciers from the Long Range Mountains and dumped there. So we were getting those. And we have done only limited ground truthing for some of that, for some of those regions where Ed had recognized these circular, highly magnetic features that may have indicated the presence of a lot of seal blood, for instance. We haven't done a whole lot of ground truthing, but so far the ground truthing is not really supporting the magnetometry as locating houses. Karina Tudor had some success when she did her master's using ground penetrating radar to identify buried features at Phillip's Garden. And Christina Robinson, who's pictured up here on the right in her bright red jacket and her bright purple hat, she took thousands of GPS readings that were geolocated in real time to construct a map of the site that showed many more potential house features than had been recorded previously. So on the left, she has these yellow depressions. So first of all, the blue areas are excavated houses that have already been identified and excavated by Harp or Priscilla. But these additional ones that she found, taking very accurate and multiple GPS readings, show that instead of the 68, we may have as many as 170 houses at the site. So that was a really helpful piece of work. Again, we haven't taken that to the next step to understand where we might, where we've ground truthed them or compared them to surrounding areas. But there's a lot of potential there. Also, Priscilla was interested in understanding the relationship between people and their environment. In the old days, we referred to this as cultural ecology or processual archaeology. She felt that what basically made a baseline for the decisions that people made about where to live and what to eat was what was present in the environment. So it was a fairly close relationship. And she saw it as an important baseline for discovering as much as possible about people. And Phillip's Garden and the nearby sites were excellent places to carry out this kind of research, since the relatively alkaline soil, the good drainage, and in the case of Phillip's Garden, the sheer magnitude of faunal deposits here allowed for incredible faunal preservation. And while there are some species of bird and fish, the almost exclusive focus at this site was seals. So here's a photograph of a midden, and you'll see a still articulated section of vertebral column with part of the pelvis coming off here, and then some rib bones. This is part of a skull on the side here. So we're talking spectacular, spectacular preservation. So her students, including Mary Beth Murray, D.A. Linehan, and Leslie House, some of you might know, they examined faunal samples from Phillip's garden to understand details of the subsistence patterns. Lisa Hodgetts was used an interesting comparison to seals of known age, and she did measurements of certain elements on the seal and was able to determine, because the migrations are so predictable, she was able to determine if she was getting newborns in the site, if she was getting last year's newborns who are not quite a year old passing by in the fall, and she knew what the size of their bones ought to be, and so she was able to demonstrate that the Dorset were hunting during both of the fall and the spring migrations. And I used a similar method to demonstrate that the Grosswater were also hunting during 2 of the seasons. Again, I'm kind of still fascinated about comparing the Grosswater and the Dorset, and this is another similarity that they had between them. So when Lisa was excavating, she also she also looked at the proportion of seals in the assemblages over time at the site. So she had a midden deposit from the early occupation, the middle occupation, and the later occupation. And one of the discoveries that she made is that the later occupation, there is a drop in the relative frequency of seal bones and an increase in the frequency of birds and fish, for instance. And she thinks that that there may have been a problem getting access to seals for whatever reason. There were years and years and years of just thick ice, so there was no access to the coast. This happens periodically in Port au Choix. The spring will bring in ice as far as the eye can see, and the seals are just way offshore. And if you have no way of getting out to them, or it's far too dangerous, then it becomes a site that is less attractive for occupation. And something like this may have triggered the abandonment of the site. So specific material culture studies have also been pretty revealing when it comes to activities at Phillip's garden. This is just a really nice picture of a whole bunch of end blades. An example of some of the material culture studies would include Rob Anstey's study of the relative frequency of ramachurt at Phillip's garden. Now, most of you know that ramachurt, but I will, for those of you who don't, ramachurt is a very easily identifiable stone material that's excellent to make tools. It was loved by all the indigenous, pre-contact indigenous peoples in the province, and they got it from a place called Rama Bay, which is in northern Labrador, and it's not available anywhere else. So it's a great kind of, you know, that somebody was there or was traded from there. It was contact with people in that region when you've got ramachurt on your site, and it is actually pretty widely distributed. But when Rob looked at its relative frequency, again, through dated assemblages, he noticed that there was a higher proportion of ramachurt during the later period. And he suggested that there was probably greater communication, movement, or certainly communication down the line from Labrador during this period. And this, of course, is the period after which the site is eventually abandoned. Rebecca Knapp did a use-wear study on the slate tool industry at this site. The slate tool industry here is remarkable. There are a lot of different tool types, and their frequency is relatively high compared to most other Dorset sites. And she was able to identify a whole range of different skin processing activities at the site. And so for my PhD, I examined the bone, antler, and ivory industry in the houses. And I looked in houses that were distributed across the site, but also across the temporal range of the occupation, just to see what kinds of tools were being made, what are they being made from, and how are they distributed across the site. So there was an uneven distribution, for instance. So I'll just give you a few examples of the things I discovered. There was an uneven distribution of bone needles that suggests that while sewing was done in all of the houses, because there were bone needles in all of the houses, that one house had a much higher proportion of needles, and this could suggest that that this particular house was chosen as a communal sewing place. It's possible that the community at Phillip's Garden had shifted demographics during the warmer months of the year when a lot of sewing would have taken place. So when you think about processing of skins, so both the spring and the fall hunts would have been during actually we call them spring and fall, but they're all winter. So it would have been a very cold period. And if you skin seals and you want to actually process them to the point where you're able to sew them, you've got to be able to wash them in water. And it's unlikely that you could get at that during those cold periods. So skins would have been stored and then in the spring, unwrapped and cleaned and prepared for processing. So when you think about the stages then, the cleaning, the stretching, the scraping, the stretching, the drying, then you use an awl, then you start sewing. You're talking about later in the summer at that point. And it's possible that some proportion of the community would have left to go hunting in the interior, would have just wanted to get out of that stinky place after a long winter and everything is thawing out. Whereas some members of the community may have found it was a good time to stick around. Perhaps some people who were caring for small children, some elderly people who didn't want to make the walk away. There would have been lots of stored meat. So it's possible that some of the demographics would have changed, would have left more women, for instance, more elderly people, and they may have chosen to live communally to some extent. What was another pretty interesting discovery was that about 45% of the industry was made from whalebone. Now, I looked at a couple of contemporary assemblages from the Arctic, and usually you're talking about 10% of the material is of the bone material is made from whale, whereas this was quite a lot. The other thing I noticed was that a number of the unique tools that I identified at the site were made exclusively of whalebone. And one of the most interesting things was also that Phillip's Garden had a very unique form of sled shoe. So that's what's pictured right here, just a collection of them. That one right there is probably just a blank. Here you have the front end, a little nose on it, and you see these countersunk holes that were grooved into them. So these pieces of whalebone, and that's a scratched up surface of a sled shoe. So this sled shoe, these sled shoes would have fit onto wooden portions of the sled above. They would have tied onto them using those holes. And this surface probably would have been given a skim of ice, mud and ice, some combination of plant and ice, and they would have been pulled around at the site. So this was a really interesting discovery as well. And since we were so interested in the use of whalebone here, and we wondered, where is the whalebone coming from? What kind of whale is it? A lot of the preforms and fragments, unworked fragments that I was finding were in long strips. It reminded me a little bit of in historic archaeology, where you find these strips of iron rod, and then they are just they break off pieces and make various tools out of them. It seemed that these strips of whalebone were cut from cores on the site. And I was trying to think, well, what part of the whale is straight enough? And because no matter how big the whale is, its ribs are curving almost from start to finish. And some of my pieces of whalebone are as long as 45 centimeters. So, so it was really, we wanted to know, where are these whales? What kind of whales are they? So we've since sampled some of the whalebone debitage from the discrete features that span the site's occupation. So these are taken from all time periods. The samples were sent for a protein analysis that has determined that of the 55 samples that we sent, 53 of them were identified as having come from right whales. So the position of the site on the peninsula along the western shores, these peninsulas sticking out into the ocean and the prevailing westerlies, they may have snagged floating dead right whales over the years, and offering the Dorset some really valuable tool making materials that in the end inspired innovation. The Dorset did have ivory, but they seemed to use it until there was only a little tiny piece left. So ivory was fairly difficult to get their hands on, and ivory is what most sled shoes in the Arctic are made out of. So the Dorset were carrying on the sled tradition here, but they were innovating because of the access, probably because of the access of these whales. And these are baleen whales, so they don't have teeth. They have these beautiful, long, smooth strips of and heavy mandibles that would have made wonderful cores from which they could cut their material. So the students involved in the Portachois project were supported to bring with them the expertise that they had during their in the other universities that they came from. And they were, they were also encouraged to bring their interest to uncover more of the secrets that this site holds. And there are other sites on the island that I can think of where this kind of thing is being done. Jim Tuck started this tradition as well in Fairyland, where he basically, you'd think about what questions you wanted answered, and you would go find the students who you felt had the interest to discover the answers to these. And I think it's one of the things that makes Newfoundland and Labrador a great place to do archaeology. And we have great archaeological traditions here. And as technology and theoretical ideas evolve, then I think that we're going to come up with more and more relevant and interesting research questions, and look forward to learning more and more about our human past. So I'll finish by just telling you a little bit about this incredible sculpture. It's a series of 3 sculptures in the Portachois National Historic Site. This one happens to be my favorite. It's on a pathway close to the beach as you walk toward Phillip's garden. And it was designed by Michael Massey, and executed by Jim Maunder. It's made of iron rods. And when I would walk out to the site at Phillip's garden, and it was a beautiful sunny day like this, you would see this line-like drawing of the Dorset pulling the seals up the beach. But on a cloudy day, or no, on a really bright sunny day, it was only on a cloudy day that they would stand out against the sky. On a sunny day, you couldn't see them against the shimmering ocean from the site. And it always reminded me of how the Dorset, they let you see a little bit, and then they don't let you see things. So they always keep you looking. They appear and they disappear. So that's it. That's a quick run through the site. And I am sorry I couldn't mention the dozens and dozens of people who have contributed to a lot of work in this area. But, you're there.
Thank you so much, Patty. That was awesome. If there are any questions, people can feel free to ask a few. We'll